So we're in the episode now. I'm going to do something that I was thinking about, okay? That's why they call us Slim Shady. We're back. We're back. That's why they call us Slim Shady.
Back.
We're back. We're back. That's why they... Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, folks from all around the world. Welcome back to Idio Talk. This is season 2. I am Walker Glenn.
I'm Zach Glenn.
And Zach, I was singing a little bit of the hook from the appropriately titled "I'm Back" from the Marshall Mathers LP by American recording artist Marshall Mathers, a.k.a. Eminem, a.k.a. Slim Shady.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because this is season 2, and we're back after a break. Just to reset for folks who might be tuning in for the first time or aren't tuning in for the first time, but, forgot what the heck we're doing here. We are brothers. We did a season 1 that was about the music of Radiohead. And that's basically because Zach and I both love music, appreciate music very deeply. We both play. Radiohead was probably the number one shared musical obsession. There's a lot of different things that we like in our individual taste. There's also a huge amount of overlap, but we had talked for a while about what's something that we both love to talk about anyway that we could do a podcast about. And I think that we both boasted a pretty solid Radiohead knowledge before we did the show, but I certainly learned a lot of things about both their music and just the arc of their career and artistry over the course of doing it. And Radiohead, they are, not unprolific, but for a very long career, they're not a band that has a ton of albums. They have 9 studio albums, but Zach and I managed to leave very few, if any, stones unturned, and we ended up getting a 35, I believe, episode season out of talking about Radiohead. Is that right?
Yeah.
And we also occasionally deviate into talking about movies. And so season 2, we're taking much the same approach, talking about another shared musical obsession, another artist whose music we love very deeply and admire greatly. We'll also occasionally deviate to talk about other shared obsessions, usually in the form of a movie that Zach and I have both seen many times. Last time it was the Batman movies. This time we're going to jump around a little more, do movies from non-franchise movies, I suppose, movies that we just happen to be obsessed with, often from our childhood. But like with Radiohead, Fiona Apple has 5 albums. This may be a slightly shorter season, but we're going to stretch it out. We're going to really try to talk about every aspect of her music and career that we can, as well as doing in-depth coverage of all her studio albums. And if you enjoy hearing us talk about music, we're really happy that you're back on board. If you're a new listener who doesn't particularly care about Radiohead, but is a huge Fiona Apple fan, we're really, really going to do our best to live up to your expectations of kind of in-depth and nuanced coverage. So that's what Idio Talk is. How'd I do, Zach?
That was, gosh, I wish that I could say, I can say it. You nailed the audition, Walker.
Wow. Thank you. So I got the job? I get to do the podcast?
I know. That's why I said I wish I could say it, because I was like, oh, it doesn't really. But no, that was wonderful. I don't have anything to add. I love it.
You're like Steven Spielberg right now in that famous audition of Henry Thomas, where he does the monologue about to the scientist about you can't take him from. Oh my God, I'm getting emotional. Where he's telling them you can't take him from me. He's my friend. Have you seen that audition?
No, but that's for E.T., right?
It's for E.T. and he's just and it's what you see in the movie. It's just this completely amazing, unself-conscious, real performance. And the kid's crying and it ends and you just hear Spielberg off camera go, Kid, I think you got the job. And then the kid like starts laughing. And that's you to me right now with how well I summated our podcast.
Have you seen the 2017 documentary Spielberg on Max? I don't want a dead name on Max.
Yeah, we did. Henceforth, calling Max HBO Max is dead naming.
I know.
No, I have not. That sounds... I would love to see that.
It's fantastic. And it's really, really cool. You know, Spielberg, legendary for how he would direct, coach, relate to, children on the set of, some of his most famous films throughout, the course of his career, whether it's Empire of the Sun, whether it's E.T., whether it's, and it's really cool to see the behind the scenes, particularly with Drew Barrymore on E.T., because, when you're giving a moment, a monologue, whatever, the tears and the emotion in that moment, those don't just go away the second the director says cut for an adult, but particularly for a child. And it's very, very touching to see him yell cut and, walk over to Drew Barrymore and be like, it's okay. It's just a movie, honey, but I need you to give me another one. I mean, I don't know how touching that last part is, but in a day and age when now we have things I'm very much in favor of, intimacy coordinators, things like to make sure that what is being portrayed on screen that is meant to look real is properly coordinated and done in cooperation and sensitivity with the actor, and I don't know if intimacy coordinator is a good one-to-one, but things, that is to say, I do believe things on a film set were much more up to the director and so forth. And this is one little moment, but it is really, really cool to see. I'm like watching it. I'm like, yeah, I don't know how else you could properly interact with a child and make sure they're okay, but also coach them into giving you another take. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, honestly, that is really good to hear because there isn't a movie that I watch with child actors that I don't feel very concerned about what that was like, because it's just like, I know there are labor laws about how long kids on film sets can work and stuff, but just
18 hours maximum.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's just, everything. It's who is this kid surrounded with outside of the set, and what were these and just how coached kid actors seem, in their press and stuff like that. But on The Shining, didn't they do a lot to kind of shoot? Or I don't know the actor's name who plays Danny, but they did. Kubrick
Danny Lloyd.
Danny Lloyd is his name.
Mm-hmm.
And that's interesting that both Jack is playing a Jack and Danny's playing a Danny.
It's so that Kubrick could talk to him saying Danny, and so that Danny would listen.
Aha. Okay.
Which
that makes sense.
I have to think applies to Jack too, but hey, there was a novel first in which the character was named Jack, so who knows?
And Danny.
And Danny, yes.
That's very Kubrick OCD.
It is.
Type of
right.
thing.
Well, and also too, like, I need to get the best out of what is the psychological component. Oh, well, a child is going to respond naturally to their name. I mean, I'm sorry you were midpoint, but I love watching the behind the scenes of The Shining. And I would say what Danny Lloyd and a lot of the child actors who worked with Spielberg have in common is that they harken back to those experiences without just a vacant, it was great, he was great, but a lot of specific bulleted reasons as to why. And I think the question you were asking, Walker, is how did they shoot around it so that Danny Lloyd wasn't traumatized by the experience of filming The Shining, which a lot of the actors, specifically Shelley Duvall and Jack Nicholson to an extent too. I do think it's overplayed what a great time he had on the set of that film.
I think it's on the record he did not have a good time on the set of that film.
No, but a podcast you and I both love, Movie Crush, I think they rightfully point out that it's a little disturbing to see some of the footage of Kubrick interacting with Shelley Duvall versus the footage of him interacting with Jack. Kind of more of a bromance than maybe the contentious relationship he had with Shelley Duvall. And I agree, but I also don't agree to an extent because he really demanded a lot out of every single actor. But they shot it in such a way to where
Shelley Duvall also had a more affectionate relationship with it. I think it's both overplayed how great Jack Nicholson got along with him and how poorly Shelley Duvall got along with him. While I do still completely think that he reserved treatment for her that he did not for his male star. They also had a sweet and affectionate relationship as well that she's talked about quite a bit over the years. I just read the whole thing about it. So it's kind of like, it's almost like we don't want to take away agency from Shelley Duvall by making her this wilting violet, shrinking violet.
Very, very well said.
Thank you. Anyway, I interrupted, but please continue.
No, just that there was painstaking efforts made to not let the actor Danny Lloyd know that he was in a horror film, and he didn't watch the film until like the year 2000, I want to say.
Whoa.
Yeah, I mean, which is difficult to imagine, but it's also difficult to imagine like wanting to watch it,
What a crazy experience that must have.
Yeah, because he would have been crazy interviews.
He would have been like my age at that point, right?
Yeah, I think he was born in
mid to late 30s.
Yeah, I think he was born in 72. So yeah, he would have been mid to late 30s. Yeah, when he saw it.
Wow, that I cannot imagine mentally what that experience would be like, watching The Shining and it's functioning as The Shining, but also as like home movies of you that you haven't seen. How strange.
And I mean, it's difficult to know where that line is, but I really like watching the footage of. I mean, shocker! I really like to watch the footage though of Kubrick directing Danny Lloyd, because he's not. He wasn't allowed to. First of all, he wasn't allowed to do repetitive take after takes. So who knows what he would have done? But Kubrick, did pioneer some of the things that we would not think of for him. So I mentioned intimacy coordinator earlier. There was no intimacy coordinator for A Clockwork Orange, but a lot of what he would and would not allow in terms of the shooting of that film went on to shape rules that, and not just in a negative way of, oh, they did this on A Clockwork Orange and look what bad things happened. Like, oh no, this is how Stanley Kubrick budgeted in for scenes that are very, very difficult to shoot. And then with The Shining, I'm not pretending that treatment of child actors, but, I'm just saying he's directing him, look more concerned, Danny, faster, harder, but he's not yelling at him. End of point. I don't have anything else good to offer.
Now it's an episode of Video Talk because we've talked about Kubrick and The Shining.
Right.
We are super excited to get into our artist of this season. Now, in season 1, on our first episode, our pilot episode of the show, we both crammed Pablo Honey, Radiohead's debut album, and kind of our overview of our relationship to Radiohead as fans, and what the kind of personal Radiohead journey had been up to that point. Fiona Apple's debut album is, I'll just say it right now, I think a much stronger debut than Radiohead's, and also a album that both your hosts have a longer relationship and connection to than we did with Radiohead's album. Now, it turned out we had a hell of a lot to say about Pablo Honey and probably wouldn't have done it that way with the benefit of hindsight anyway. All that to say, on this episode, we're going to talk more generally about Fiona Apple, the person, the artist, our connection to her music, when we got into it, where we're at with it now, etc., and then talk about Tidal as its own episode next week. So listeners, if you're, familiar with Fiona Apple's music or not, good time to refamiliarize yourself with that album in the intervening week.
And don't worry, listeners. Walker and I, like Spielberg and other directors, have gone back and added CGI inserts to our first episode of our first season to make sure that, with the benefit of hindsight, that episode is who we have become as podcasters now. It's not fun for listeners to hear the evolution and the growth. It's fun for them to imagine what it would be like if we were pros when we started.
That's right. And like the 30th anniversary of E.T., the CGI inserts of Zach and I going back and making the points we wish we could have are not deeply upsetting to look at. God, that would be so funny if we did an AI because actually we didn't even talk about every track on Pablo Honey. We talked about the ones that we had like strong opinions about. In any case, we're not gonna call it a mistake or call it growth, like you said. Call it appropriate for Pablo Honey, but inappropriate for Tidal. We're giving that its whole damn own episode this time. So
yes.
Did you have an interjection, Zach?
Not at all. No.
Well, I was just going to ask you before we kind of dive into the topic at hand. We're deep into summer now. How has your summer been? Has it been a summer vacation for you? Taking some time off from Idio Talk, or what have you been up to?
Yeah, it has. It really has. I mean, it's well, I just want to start off by saying I have missed this. I don't know about you. I'm really, really excited to be back.
I can't say that I have. This is feeling a little. This is, look, it's a good job, but it is a job. No, of course I've missed this. I'm so excited to be doing it again. I'm so excited to be doing it about a new topic. But most of all, whoever we were talking about, whatever band or musician, I'm excited to be gabbing away with my brother Zach again.
I know. You too, man.
Because we don't really talk. Listeners don't know. We don't. We refused, since we started the podcast, it's all content. Anytime Zach starts to talk to me or I start to talk to him, one of us puts a finger up and it's like, I'm sorry.
Don't make me touch the sign.
Don't make me tap the sign, which is all conversations are content, is what the sign says.
But yeah, I'm really excited to be. I mean, I had the opportunity to record with a friend. Shout out Caleb Hodgson, who has a show called Deep in the Bag. And I think the episode's coming out this week. I cannot wait for you to hear it. He's a listener to our show, which was just so fun to sit down and chat with somebody who Caleb's a really, really excellent recording engineer for like his day job. So he had nothing but really, really great things to say about where our own editor, Walker Glenn, has chosen to make cuts in our show, which I thought was really cool. And we didn't just talk about our show. So getting on the mic with Caleb, though, made me be like, man, I miss this. But it was cool, though, to take a little bit of a break. I would say in May and June specifically is when I really started to feel like a little bit of like, man, it's nice to just delve back into my other interests. I wouldn't say new interests, but I definitely was able to read more in May and June than I had before. Let's see. I would just say read more, watch, and got back. Oh, that was it. Got back into some of my mainstay podcasts that I fell behind on. And it wasn't that doing our show prohibited me from reading and listening to podcasts, but I think that there's just a natural thing of, when you're putting in a ton of effort on your own for your own project, that maybe you're going to have a little bit less mental energy for those things. But yeah, haven't picked up really too many new hobbies or anything like that. But really, really enjoyed the time off. How about you?
I know you've been playing a lot of guitar, and if listeners...
been playing a ton of guitar. That's it. That was the other thing, yeah.
If listeners follow us on idiotalk.podcast, that's a great place to check out Zach's progress that he makes as he learns a lot of different songs, not just by Radiohead, the artist we've covered, and by Fiona Apple, the artist we're covering now, but just other music that he loves, Mars Volta, Elliott Smith, so some Smashing Pumpkins. I pop in occasionally and tickle the old ivories as well. I don't know why I said that. I don't play piano. But yeah,
Fiona.
Yeah, I guess so. But anyway, yeah, tickling the ivories now, we should just make that a euphemism for playing music, period.
I love it.
But yeah, anyway, great place to check out Zach's awesome interpretations of like a lot of different music. Follow us there if you haven't. Just quick plug for our gram.
But tell me about your break, though. I mean, more of the same? Anything? I know comedy's been real busy.
Doing a lot of stand-up. I don't think my stand-up schedule was very impacted by us doing the podcast, but I have been a lot busier lately. I have kind of taken on, I mean, speaking of all conversations are content, I have kind of taken on the discipline of making sure to be kind of showing my work in the social media space and posting a lot of clips, posting at least a clip a week. I guess I'll plug this now too. If you are a fan of ours, a fan of the podcast, I'm also a stand-up comedian, so give me a follow at WalkerJFGlenn on Instagram, where I'm posting stand-up shit on a regular basis. But yeah, I've been doing a lot of that. I would say the thing that I've been doing more of that is something that I consider among the things I do or consider to be part of my resume, but it is harder to find time for when we're like really diligently producing work for the podcast, is a lot more writing. And listeners probably are, some of our listeners are probably aware of the website The Hard Times. It's a satirical news site, not unlike The Onion, but with a focus on music culture, and specifically not limited to, but with a focus on kind of punk and rock and roll and indie, and making fun of kind of those subcultures of music. But
it's a cool differentiator, because other than that, yeah, I mean, it's like there's not like The Onion has a trademark on satire, especially satire in the news. But I do like that sort of sub focus of The Hard Times. I think it's really cool.
Yeah, they make fun of, and it's like, and I would say they like do culture as well, but it's kind of like specifically like, you know, hipster punker type of culture when they do deviate into that. Anyway, that been a contributor pitching headlines and then getting to write articles of the ones that get picked up for a couple years, but recently they've moved into doing non-satirical content as well, which really opened up an opportunity for like the contributors to get to pitch a lot more stuff. And so in the last few months, I've gotten to write some non-satirical
some really great
articles about music and specific. And so I don't know if listeners want to read that stuff. I type my name into the search bar at thehardtimes.net, but I will specifically put a plug out for the two articles that I'm probably the most proud of. Are I got to rank all the Wilco albums and rank all the Screaming Females albums.
A personal favorite of mine.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I mean, both of them are things that I kind of like. I tried to put jokes and humor in there, but I have to admit I took the assignment pretty seriously.
Yeah.
And it resulted in me learning a lot more about two bands that I love. I think the thing that was cool about it is Wilco is a band that I there's been so much coverage of them over their career that it's like it was kind of, I felt free to kind of just discuss it from a like personal point of view of like which albums speak to me more than others and why. And Screaming Females is a band that is by no means unknown, but is like, I would say, you know, like we saw them in a club with a few hundred people, and they're just
Great
kind of
show.
they're a constantly touring outfit that is signed and everything, but is like based in New Jersey where they started and everything like that. And more obscure than Wilco, is I guess what I'm saying. Sure. And so with that, it was kind of exciting to get to write about their music from the point of view of this might actually be me getting to recommend them to somebody. And I was really proud of the fact that on that one, the band's social media accounts actually plugged and retweeted and reposted the article. And so, yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'll throw those in the show notes. Those are two I really like, but if you enjoy those, I've been doing a lot of writing for the Hard Times, and getting to write about music is not something that I really ever expected to get to do, but I will directly credit our podcast with giving me the confidence to feel like I belong in that space at all, of talking about music from a critical point of view. It's not something I feel like I would have really volunteered for when they asked for it on the website if I hadn't just spent the last year talking about Radiohead with you and with other people who understand music from a very analytic and serious point of view. So that's the thing I've been excited about this summer.
There was that's amazing, and I really do hope that we put the articles in the show notes because I really
I'll do it. Why not? I want people to read them. I'm proud of them.
Yeah, I really, really enjoyed them. There was a band that I was not familiar with, but that messaged us after our Amnesiac Parts 1 and 2 episodes came out. They messaged us through the podcast Instagram, and they said, I'm curious to co-host Zach. Do you have any experience in music journalism? And I wrote back, no, but thank you for asking. No, this is my first venture into discussing music, blah, blah, blah. And they just wrote back, okay, thanks. So I think they were impressed and they were like, well, we want someone with more experience. I don't know.
That's interesting.
I know. It was like definitely a compliment because I'm sure they were, well, not I'm sure. I'm supposing maybe they were impressed by what we had to say. But whatever they were going to ask, they definitely wanted somebody who would be like, yes, and here are my references or something like that. But talking about Wilco, though, do you know where I first heard of the band Wilco? I may as well just tell you. I don't think you're going to guess. But in the 2009 film Funny People by Judd Apatow starring Adam Sandler, Seth Rogen, there's a big plot point that hinges on them going to a Wilco show.
Yes.
And I could just tell by the way that the band was being kind of discussed. And I can't recall if there's Wilco songs peppered throughout on the soundtrack. I wouldn't be surprised if there are. But I was like, I'm going to check them out. You know, just based on the way the characters and the cast of this movie are talking about them with some sort of reverence. And that's when I got into them. So 2009, gosh, 14 fucking years ago at this point.
That's so disturbing. I know that movie is another kind of shared.
I love that movie.
Yeah, you know, I really want to rewatch it. I did we not see it in the theater together?
We did not. No,
we've watched it together, haven't we?
Probably.
Because I
really enjoy that movie.
I really like it too, and I know that we agree that it's our favorite Judd Apatow movie. Do we not?
Oh yeah, for sure.
But I got to be honest, it's not. I've seen other Judd Apatow movies more times. It's just had a really strong impact on me the few times I have seen it, and I'm very much due for a rewatch of it because I would say it's probably been about 8 to 10 years at this point. But I think it's a very all his movies are personal and things that, you know, are either pulling from his life or things that he really cares about. But I feel like his, anyway, I don't know why I'm turning this to a negative because I like his movies. I just feel like his relationship and what he has to say about comedians and comedy specifically feels very lived in and fleshed out, maybe more so than other things that he's, you know, kind of made movies about.
It really lends itself to the improvisational style that is present throughout. And I would say a lot of movies have been influenced by Judd Apatow. By no means invented improvisation in a script at all. But that was really, really big when he started doing it from 2005 to kind of up to present day. And I think it's like a lot of things, the style has been somewhat overused to the extent where just because somebody is improvising doesn't mean it's funny. Looking at you, Paul, who's the guy who directed Ghostbusters too. Paul Feig. You know, it's a hard thing because it's like when you have the cast that was, say, in something like Ghostbusters 2, who are all phenomenal improvisational comics, I think the impulse is like, hey, it's got to be good, but that's not always the case. But in Funny People, because it's about comedians, you know, and having spent, I would say, a good deal of time around people that are, you know, pursuing that endeavor or are in it, there is that vibe sometimes where it is like somewhat casual, but a lot of people kind of pushing the envelope as far as in just normal conversation. And I think you see that in Funny People, and I think it works. It fundamentally works. It doesn't feel out of place like it does in certain scenes in Knocked Up, which is a movie that I love. But, you know, and I also think it's the birth of the serious Sandman, which we know now from Uncut Gems and from, it's not that Adam Sandler isn't funny in it. He's very funny, but he plays a very dark version of himself. And it's just a really, really incredible performance, in my opinion. And listeners, I do think it's getting that sort of false thing that guest Casey Pegram talked about that he doesn't like when a movie will get a lot of buzz because it'll go on the streamers. I think that might be happening right now with Funny People. But you know what? Loving what Casey said and being able to laugh at it, I also think, too, there's nothing wrong with something you love, people discovering it, too, for the first time. So if Funny People is available to stream, go check it out. It's such a great movie.
Well, okay, this actually, feeds into. So I was about to tell Zach something before we recorded, but then he tapped the sign that said all conversation is content.
Yeah.
And he was like, maybe we can talk. He doesn't even know what it is, but it's related specifically to kind of summer comedies or, blockbuster comedies, big tentpole movie releases that are comedies. So I am not by any means the first person to point out that big star-driven comedies in terms of opening like box office weekends are kind of going the way of the dinosaur.
Yeah.
Which is sad to say, but the blockbuster comedy as like a thing that will pack out a theater, not a big thing anymore. Like, when's the last time you went to the theater to go see the new Seth Rogen movie or the new Will Ferrell movie?
Daddy's Home 2, of course.
Right, exactly. Like it's like The Hangover or whatever is probably kind of towards the end of this era of exactly. And it's those movies still get made, but they tend to be smaller releases if they even get a theatrical release or go straight to streamers now, which is fine as long as they still make them and everything like that. But it is an interesting thing. I have been noticing, there's a lot of ways to kind of look back on an era and kind of correlate what's happening in media to both the cultural and political climate of the time. And sometimes those connections are really tenuous or maybe you squint to make them a little bit, but I always think that it's very fun to kind of analyze
Malcolm
culture
Gladwell style a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. Or Chuck Klosterman or Adam Curtis makes amazing documentaries where he kind of have you ever seen an Adam Curtis documentary? Hypernormalization. Sure. He's a British guy. No. He makes these BBC documentaries they're basically kind of like long narrated cultural essays that tie all these dark political themes into music and literature and culture, basically. Things that are like not, I like things like that are not necessarily like factually verifiable, but are interesting. Well, Nicole and I recently just watched, I don't know if you've ever seen it, but we just watched, cause I saw it played at the gym with no sound on and I'd never seen it. I was like, this movie looks funny. Neighbors, the 2014 Seth Rogen comedy. Pretty funny movie, I thought.
Yeah, there's some funny moments for sure. I really like Seth Rogen and Rose Byrne as a pairing.
I really like them. I actually think Zac Efron as the muscle-bound douche is. I think he's pretty funny. I thought it was like a very serviceably funny movie. I basically got exactly what I expected out of it, which is that it's a few really funny set pieces. Yes. A lot of improvising, some of which is funnier than others, but it's a very like funny, okay 2014 comedy. But in terms of like the tone of it, we were like really feeling like it's like, oh my God, this is such a like pre-Trump movie, and not in the way, kind of both in a way of like, ooh, you can't say that anymore, but not in a way that's like super cringy, but it's like, oh, this is like a little bit of like the end of like an era of comedies that exist in this kind of Obama era, like white person optimism of like, hey, racism's over. Like it's kind of like, and it's very like 10 years ago, 9 years ago in this case, but 10 years ago when you watch movies from that time, it feels so recent and so long ago at the same time, where it's having fun and reveling in itself in this very kind of, I think kind of not always to movies betterment or TV's betterment. Like everything is pretty concerned with having something to say now in kind of the political and cultural landscape we're in. And movies from 10 years ago are not that. It is like gleefully dumb. Ike Barinholtz says the N-word twice. Both in ways where it's like you get what the joke is that they're going for, but you also are like, they would decide to go ahead and not make this joke now. You know what I mean? And it's only the movie's 9 years old, and I bring all that up to say, A, is this a thing you've observed about that time? But B, I am kind of noticing with the summer releases of 2023, I'm starting to see kind of dumb, crass comedies are starting to get pushed again. And I'm curious what kind of cultural shift might be taking place now where it's like, is this a sign of kind of like political fatigue, maybe post-pandemic specifically, of like, okay, we're kind of getting back to the dumb a little bit. And anyway, that was the topic I wanted to throw out to you. Is this a thing you've observed, and what do you think about that?
I really hope we get an opportunity to keep this, just because I think that's such a stellar observation, and I'm delighted at the opportunity to answer the question. I will both just say right off the top, I don't know how I would put into words how comedies have changed in the last 10 years better than what you would. And I don't know that I would have had that specific of insights to offer, but definitely comedies during the Obama era versus post-Trump era. So let's say, even though he was elected in 2016 and there's a lot of buzz, I would say 2017 to 2020, right? Even though he was president for longer than that, movies definitely, took a pause in the 2020. And it always takes a year for things to catch up, blah, blah, blah. I think to kind of but to commentate on your observation in reverse, without putting this too much in its time, with a timestamp or whatever, that HBO miniseries Love and Death that recently came out. One of the things that I think you and I had talked about, and I noticed if we hadn't talked about it, was, I think what it really demonstrated for me was that there has been a backlash to true crime topics, reveling so much in the gratuity of something without making a point, and kind of not in the way a horror movie can offer catharsis, but in a more kind of more dirty way, because it is true crime. Where it's like, sure, it's portraying the perpetrators of the crime as villainous or whatever, but it's not like, and I'm thinking specifically of the Ted Bundy docuseries that came out in early 2019. I read a book called Notes on an Execution that has a whole appendix about that miniseries. And the author wrote the book for many, many reasons, but she mainly wrote it from the POV of female victims in revolt to how I watched that Netflix series. I can't pretend I didn't find it fascinating, but I really did think about it afterwards of like, this feels more like a heist film than it does like a documentary on somebody who raped and fucking murdered brutally, 30 plus victims that they know about. I'm sorry, listeners, if it's more confirmed, over 100, they speculate, or hundreds. Right. And the tone of it is just all wrong. And what Love and Death did so well is it does talk about a true crime. It does eventually play out the murder, but it feels like it's written from a perspective of how do we commentate on this without just reveling in the brutality of it. And I feel like that's just, it's sort of goes along the lines of what you were saying of comedy is still comedy. It's still a little bit silly. And Love and Death is a demonstration of true crime is still true crime. There's still going to be a specific kind of audience member that has a certain level of tolerance, or interest or whatever that's going to watch it. But it does feel like it's more thought out how they're going to portray certain things. So you weren't looking for a. Does that make sense at all in terms of a response?
Absolutely,
kind of?
Absolutely. But I think it's mostly a good thing. But I think it's always a good thing when the bar gets raised, right? When it's like we're gonna start looking at the content that we're creating, there's these there's things that are no longer taken for granted, because people point out like, hey, this trope or this thing, it's kind of fucked up, and maybe we should examine it in a more intelligent way. I'm all for that, but I also think that the need of, especially of art of the last few years, specifically the Trump era, the desire for everything in movies and television to like make a case for itself of why it should exist has also been, I think, has been bad as well, or has had a bad effect as well on things that I really enjoy, that it creates bloat and self-seriousness for things that don't warrant them also. Like, for example, I felt that way very strongly about the last two films in the Halloween franchise, is that they're trying to load social commentary into them. In a genre, horror is a particularly great genre for social commentary. But it's like, I don't know that the Halloween franchise is set up for you. Like, that's kind of one of those areas where I go, hey, if you want to make a good Halloween movie, it's not that you can't have a point or have something to say.
It's not, but I don't know if the first film was even devoid of maybe a greater point. Perhaps.
No, the first Halloween 2018, which I know we both really love, does have a comment. Does deepen the character of Laurie Strode and have something to say about trauma, and and probably has something to say too about the pedestal that we put killers up on culturally and things like that. But I don't know that you can 15 films into what ultimately is meant to be kind of silly entertainment, like load all these like contemporary social themes into it. Or I know we've talked off mic about how like Eat the Rich has become a thing to, it's a theme that I absolutely love. Class consciousness making its way more into contemporary movies is something that I really enjoy, but I also don't appreciate it as a just shortcut to giving your film depth that it doesn't necessarily have. I did not see The Restaurant. Is that what it was called? That movie you really hated? It wasn't called
Is
The
that
Restaurant,
what it was called?
was it?
No.
The one with Ralph Fiennes and
Anya
The Menu.
Taylor-Joy. The Menu.
I did not
was
see
the
that.
worst film I've ever seen in my entire life. And when I say that, I mean the worst film that I've ever seen that had a big budget and a stellar cast. So very, very specific criteria it has to meet. But I was not a fan of that movie. Please continue.
No, yeah. I mean, I didn't see that, but I didn't hate this movie, but I thought the Oscar-nominated satire Triangle of Sadness that came out last year.
Oh, I've not seen that.
I ultimately found it like pretty shallow, and it's like cultural commentary and stuff, and it's taking points that I tend to agree with, but I feel like it's like borrowing them from culture as just like, oh, people kind of hate rich people right now. Like, can we do something with that? What's my point? My point is, getting back to now, is this summer there are these big comedies coming out. One is like a sex comedy with Jennifer Lawrence, where she's like playing like a MILF who is, I think, hired by a nerdy college student to like kind of give him social cachet or something like that. It's some sort of sex comedy, and it looks very bawdy. I've also heard it's very funny. I'm probably going to go see it. There's a movie coming out where Will Ferrell and Jamie Foxx are voicing dogs. That's like a very hard R-rated comedy that I'm very excited for. It looks very funny, but I'm just saying I feel like we're kind of, to me, it's indicating a little bit of a cultural pivot back towards the stupid. And I'm just curious, is that because we have a quote unquote normal president in the White House with Joe Biden? Is it because people were inside for a year and a half? Is it because of exhaustion from very high profile social justice movements like Me Too, Black Lives Matter? What's going on?
Oh, man. I mean, I can't begin to know the answer, but I think that it's probably a mix of all of those things. And I think that what's unfortunate is I think it's both fortunate and unfortunate, right? I think it's good for a lot of the reasons you said, that like entertainment is exactly that. I think what's really cool is that science fiction and horror, maybe horror less so and more recently so, have always found a really great latitude to commentate on such broad things as social commentary points, whether it's racial injustice or inequality, between gender or whatever. Pick your topic, right? I feel like horror and sci-fi have always had a lot of latitude in that regard, which is great. It does kind of, just to tie it back to an earlier subject, it does make me a little bit sad. Like I think about the movie Full Metal Jacket, came at a time in which Vietnam War and the war movie kind of commentary, there was a lot of fatigue and exhaustion of, and because of that, it does not matter. But that movie did not get a single Oscar nomination, which is crazy to me that Fatal Attraction did, in the same year. So I think that sometimes,
and it wasn't very high performing. I know it's very well regarded now, still kind of on the low end of a lot of people's Kubrick's list, which it's not on mine, but it also didn't perform very well commercially at the time either, did it?
It did. It did.
Oh, okay.
It did pretty
Fair
well.
enough.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. All of his movies tended, except for Barry Lyndon, tended to do pretty well at the box office and tended to take a good 10 years to, and there's complete exceptions to that. Clockwork Orange, 2001, but tended to kind of stay out of the Oscar territory beyond like sound design or visual effects, or whatever. But no best actor nomination for Matthew Modine, which I think is crazy, or Adam Baldwin, which I think is crazy, or whatever. Take your pick. Or of course, Pyle,
Vincent D'Onofrio.
Vincent D'Onofrio. I mean, that's insane. Whatever. I just think that that's an example of when, fatigue from the culture kind of is directed one way. And I think there's good things about it. Walker and I'm comfortable saying sorry, I'll speak for myself. I don't believe that we are of the mind that actors, movies, musicians, athletes should not be using their platform to speak their mind, even if it is not something that I agree with, right? Ted Nugent being an example. I have no interest in what he has to say. I have no interest in him losing that ability either, unfortunately, right? And but I think the culture is going to move in swings, and I think oftentimes studios are representative of that, but are also kind of, because of the amount of money and planning and everything that goes into making a movie, sort of can be like a year behind in a way. Yeah. And so it is interesting to sort of feel that, right? It's like, so I don't know. I really, really agree with that observation. I think it's a stellar one, and it'll be interesting to see kind of what the movement continues to be, because things do move in chunks, right?
Yeah. And I mean, I know I only have two examples of like kind of like big, crass, hard R-rated comedies, but I just, I feel like it'll be interesting to watch and see how we're kind of swinging, because I feel like you take any filmic release, non-Marvel, basically, non-superhero of the last 5-6 years, and it is rife with social commentary. And I think that has been both made. I think it's been an incredible few years for movies. I've seen a bunch of my favorite movies, that probably ultimately will be in my like top 50 or 100 films have come out in the last decade. But it's also, it's just like everything else you said. It's just like the improvisational style of comedies in the early 2000s. Things become a copy of a copy of a copy. I'm certainly not advocating for, hey, can we have movies with less commentary? I also am not unhappy about it if we're going to start getting more fun genre movies again, because I love a dumb comedy if it's successful. I love a slasher movie, and so it's fun to see things come out and present themselves on their own merits of just like, this is going to be scary or this is going to be funny, and that can still be enough to open a movie would make me happy.
I do want to get to the thrust of this episode, but I can't let this sneak by. I also think too that in an era where maybe movies or genre pieces are less concerned with having a ton to say on an allegorical level, I know a film that we're both big fans of would be Step Brothers. And I recently rewatched it. And I bring that movie up because, anytime you rewatch a film with a little bit of time on your back and a little bit of whether it's interest in production or just time of life that you've lived, I do feel like you're going to notice something if the film is worth its salt, which that movie absolutely is. And what I noticed rewatching it this time is clearly how funny it is. But, I saw that movie 3 times in the movie theater. I've seen it quite, a couple times since it's been able to stream, but it had been 7 to 10 years since I'd watched it. Right. Yeah. And I had never noticed that who's the actor who plays Adam Scott's wife? She's really, really
Catherine Hahn.
Blown up. Yeah, Catherine Hahn. That was early in her career of bigger films. She's quite young in it. And I had never noticed to the degree that I did what a kept woman she is, because it never made sense to my younger mind why she developed this elaborate connection with John C. Reilly's character.
Right.
It just didn't click, right? And I think that's good because,
the character is deeply in pain.
deeply in pain, deeply kept woman, deeply just vacant to the extent because of the level of abuse she endures. I don't want to say it didn't click at all, but I didn't get it. I'll just admit, right? Yeah. And I always thought Adam Scott was funny and a douchebag in it, but I didn't realize that he was yelling at somebody who is deeply beaten into the ground. The other thing I noticed was that it was written by Adam McKay and Will Ferrell. And I was like, gosh, I have to imagine that Will Ferrell, maybe started having kids probably in his mid to late 30s. And I looked it up, and this is true because I was like, oh, he wrote it. The style of jokes that he wrote for he and John C. Reilly, which I'm sure there's an abundance of improvisation in that film, clearly, but is clearly somebody who is father to young boys who ask the unnecessary permissions that he and John C. Reilly's character ask, even when you tell them, yes, it's fine, you can take a shower. No, you don't need to ask me every time you need to take a shower, or whatever, the way when they're building their bunk beds, I'm like, it's coming from a place of, it feels fresh and new, like maybe those were new ideas to Will Ferrell. And I just wouldn't have picked that up before. And that isn't a really sophisticated read on the film, because I don't think the film is begging for you to read a bunch of sophistication into it. But all I'm saying is that comedies and any type of film, it's really fun to go back and see, and maybe you're less inhibited because there's not some deeper analysis that it's asking for written into it. I don't know.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I don't know if
rich on their own.
Yes, I love that movie now. The first time I saw it, I think this was a time in my life, a time in a young man's life. I think that a lot of young people go through, maybe, and maybe specifically young men, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's just specific to me. I don't know if you felt like in your early 20s, a lot of your personality was derived from not liking things.
Yes and no. Yeah. I can definitely relate to that feeling.
Yeah. I just I saw this movie in the theater and I hated it. And then I saw it again, a decade later. It was just I don't even, it's hard for me to connect to the version of me that saw this and didn't enjoy it. It is so funny to me. But what I hated about it is what I love about it now, which is I kind of had a really hard time accepting that the basic premise of this movie is that for no reason that is ever explained,
right,
John C. Reilly and Will Ferrell act like young pre-adolescent boys for the entire movie.
It is frustrating because it doesn't make, in theater, the illusion, and they kind of touch on it in the flashback scene where Will Ferrell is on stage and it's Will Ferrell. They make no attempt to make him look younger. In theater, though, it's and this is what cracks me up so much with people acting like dressing in drag is a new thing. The Greeks, for instance, they would make almost no attempt to make a man actually look and sound like a woman. And I wonder if in Step Brothers, even though the surrounding cast is constantly saying 39 and 40 years old, so they're reminding you that these are grown men, but everything else they do, they behave like children. So it is a little bit confusing to understand what type of illusion they're going for. But if you let that go and you just kind of let the comedy speak for itself, and to what I was saying too, I'm not saying everyone has to do this, but to what may have been happening in Will Ferrell's life personally, and maybe John C. Reilly, I don't know. But, it really becomes very, very funny if you can kind of let that go and not need to have the illusion explained.
Yeah, I don't know what was wrong with me. I think it's just absurd. It's like me watching a Monty Python sketch, and while Graham Chapman is going like, "Well, I didn't vote for you," me being like, "That's not a woman. Like that's not an old peasant lady." Like, I don't know what was wrong with me, but the funniest parts to me are too the way Will Ferrell, like John C. Reilly goes for like the kind of like
brooding
thing that
15-year-old
the thing that kids do where they act hyper confident about things that they don't know shit about is like his move. And Will Ferrell's thing is to do the kind of a lot of stuttering and interrupting yourself, and those they both capture very specific things about like 10 to 14-year-olds that are really really funny. But my favorite part in the movie is after he sings for John C. Reilly, and he hasn't seen that John C. Reilly is astonished and amazed at what he did.
Yes.
The acoustics are not good in this room, and I just what does he say? Like, and my voice, I didn't exercise my voice. Yeah. And
let's give him something to talk about, which is a song by one of my favorite female artists, Bonnie Raitt. Does that at all lead us into what we're talking about today, Walker? Not Bonnie Raitt, but
that is a very good transition. So let's set the table a little bit just by getting some of the basic information. Because interestingly, I think in kind of a little bit of a juxtaposition to last season, we're discussing a solo artist.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to be a little more informational about a person and an individual, right?
Mm-hmm.
So why don't we talk about who Fiona Apple McAfee Maggart is, or is it Maggart? Would you say? How would you pronounce
Maggart?
That? Yeah. So Zach, tell us who's Fiona Apple, who we're discussing this season.
Well, you just said her full name, Walker. It is Fiona Apple McAfee Maggart. That is with a hyphen between Apple and McAfee. She was born September 13th, 1977.
I believe. I'm sorry to push back already. I believe the hyphen is between McAfee and Maggart because those are the last names of her two parents. So Fiona Apple is probably technically her middle name, and what a great name to be able to use as your stage name.
Yeah, to be associated with such an ethical company. Oh my goodness, I love it.
Oh, yeah, actually, I should just get my little catchphrase out of the way now that I'm going to probably say several times throughout this podcast, which is Fiona is the only good Apple product.
Ooh. And I would like to just point out that we chose the artist Fiona Apple because both Radiohead and Fiona Apple had a surprise hit that began with the letters C and R, creep and criminal.
That's right.
That's
Tom York came out, declared himself a creep. Fiona Apple came out and declared herself a scofflaw at large. Should we also say, too, last season was Idio Talk, a Radiohead podcast. This season, I would like to submit the subtitle Idio Talk, an Apple podcast. Ooh. So it's both into the app Apple Podcasts, and it is an Apple podcast.
Yeah, and that's all going to be part of the title too, and that's TIADAL. Everything Walker just said after is also going to be included. It's going to be a long ass title, like a Fiona Apple song,
like a Fiona Apple title, right? This is Idio Talk. A podcast. We'll have to write this up later, but there's Win the Pawn is
right. A lot of dots, ellipses,
right, and the Idler Wheel are both. But we will say I do not have the full titles memorized. They're both. I believe long. Win the Pawn is still the record for longest album title ever. But yeah, so this is Idio Talk, and the podcast will serve you in ways that the radio broadcasts never did, as the chains hold you back. It'll go on. Obviously, this is much less good than a Fiona Apple poem because she is a poet as well as a musician. But Zach, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Set the table for us a little bit on Fiona.
So she was born Fiona Apple McAfee Maggart. She was born September 13th, 1977. At the time of this recording, that puts her at age 45. She was born in New York, New York. That was where she was raised in her primary residence. Even up through today, she does maintain a pretty specific presence in Los Angeles, California. But you're born in New York. It's hard to shed those New Yorker chains. Am I right? I don't know. There's no catchphrase there.
I think she does, and I do think that she comes off as more of an East Coast personality than a West Coast one.
Totally. So this is those that are familiar with Fiona Apple. One thing I should say, and I know Walker said in previous episodes, and maybe in this very episode, Walker and I always strive to go beyond the Wikipedia when it comes to the artist, the album, the individual that we are talking about. In the case of Fiona Apple, I would like to draw, and I will do this throughout, and hopefully at some point I'll get a chance to credit the individual who has really helped in the research of this podcast. I don't have that permission at the time, so I'm not going to do it. But the Reddit community has been instrumental in providing a lot of links, organized research that this person has done about Fiona Apple themselves. Not a lot of that is going to come into play on this introduction episode. So listeners, if you're following along on the Wikipedia, a lot of this is going to ring familiar. But just bear with us, and I did want to put that in. But like I said,
can I say one thing on that point?
Please,
too?
please.
Which is just that I think another thing that'll be really cool about this season, and again, kind of just a distinction from the Radiohead season. One thing we talked a lot about with them is there's a great deal of speculation that has to take place about Radiohead's process, where their musical and lyrical inspiration kind of comes from. With Fiona Apple, I would say, even just kind of getting ready for this first episode, there is so much of Fiona Apple in her own words.
Yeah.
And even though she is kind of known as a bit of a reclusive person, she's very, very direct in how she talks about herself and her music and her process and where it comes from and what it means to her. So I'm excited to be able to not have to speculate to the same degree and be able to quote the source directly in this season.
I'm really glad that you interjected that, because this is something that represented a bit of a need for a pivot for me. So one thing that I was really confident and excited about going into the Radiohead season was the amount of, experience, both direct and listening to the music, and preemptive research that I had done unwittingly. If that sounds like a brag, I guess it's because it is, but I was a huge fan of the wonderful book, Everything in Its Right Place, Analyzing Radiohead by Dr. Brad Osborne, that I was just a huge fan of going into. And then there's quite a few different biographies that I had read. Those are all external, right? And most of those did not have interviews with the band. They were all published books, so, reputable sources, so to speak. But like Walker just said, and I think that has really lent itself to a two-pronged approach in terms of researching this artist that we love so much in Fiona Apple, which is just to say that I really like a kind of type A approach. I don't even know if that's the right wording, but, what are the biographies I can find? What are the external commentaries that, written by people that are conceivably older than myself that have gotten to look at this whole career? And Fiona Apple, I would say, has just lent itself to a different style of research. So I think it's always great, right? When Walker and I even were talking about what artist do we want to talk about, I initially rejected the idea of talking about Fiona Apple, not because I don't love her music or anything like that, but it felt like a little bit of a challenge after talking about a group of 5 men plus Nigel, or whatever. And this is where I really want to give you some cred, Walker. Walker said, okay, cool, let's think about other things. Broach the subject one more time, and here we are today. So very nice job there, Walker. I'm really, really excited. Whether or not we nail this challenge is up to the listener, but I'm really, really excited. But to kind of get back to just the most basic of information, Fiona Apple's father was a gentleman by the name of Brandon Maggart. He is still alive today. I believe he was born in 1939. That would put him in age 83. But Brandon was an actor. Brandon is an actor, a painter, and an author. He was born Roscoe Maggart Jr. in Carthage, Tennessee. His acting career began at the University of Tennessee in the early 1950s. He eventually won a Theater Art Award for his performance in the musical review Put It in Writing. Maggart was also an accomplished singer. right? So shocker there. But he was an accomplished singer with the Knoxville Symphony, winning the Grace Moore Award, which is what kind of propelled his career in New York, right? Even if you're a big star in Tennessee, the biggest stage is always going to be in New York, right, on Broadway. Maggart's career as an actor continued to blossom, and in 1970, he was nominated for a Tony Award for Applause. He continued to work steadily in theater and TV, culminating in a critically acclaimed role in the television show Brothers. Brothers was a groundbreaking series that ran from 1984 to 1989 on Showtime. Like I say, Maggart, was nominated 4 times for cable's ACE Awards, and I believe the ACE Awards are actor in outstanding performance in a comedy role. So Diane McAfee was an actress and singer, primarily on stage. Some prominent and impactful credits. I'm sorry to say, but she was much harder to find. Even
I noticed that too.
Half, yes. So it's not our fault, listeners.
Yeah,
because I would actually say I found myself more interested in Fiona Apple's mother, not because Brandon is not incredibly interesting and accomplished, but Diane McAfee. Some prominent and impactful credits, was the play Flora, the Red Menace. That opened May 11th, 1965. It's a bird. The other credits I found were It's a Bird, It's a Plane, It's Superman. That opened March 29th, 1966. And then the aforementioned Applause, which opened March 30th, 1970. She starred as Eve Harrington as a replacement. And she eventually met Brandon Maggart, Fiona's father, on this very production. Eventually became pregnant and had Fiona, much later. Fiona Apple was born, like I said, 1977. But Fiona Apple does have siblings, fathered by Brandon Maggart. So Fiona has siblings, but the one that I really wanted to highlight now would be Maud Maggart, or her birth name, Amber Maud McAfee Maggart. She was born February 24th, 1975, also in New York. And I actually do have I have a couple different bios pulled up here right now. A really, really stellar review by Paul Freeman, which was written in March of 2010, talks about just some of her collaborations that are of note. But, the genre that she primarily is a star in is cabaret, which is not, a type of performance that generally has a lot of, interest. To me, not to say I discount it or anything like that, but she's done a collaboration with Brett Spiner, who plays Data in Star Trek The Next Generation in 2008. She has many, 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 many hundreds of credits. I just did not have the time to really delve into Maud Maggart. Maybe Walker, if you have anything to add. That's just to say, though, that Fiona Apple, now we have that word for generational wealth, or more, maybe Nepo baby is actually a lot more applicable here. It was no surprise to me that Fiona Apple comes from a family of very, very, very gifted, talented, and this wasn't new to me, this level of information, very, very, very talented and gifted singers and performers and writers as well. What do you think, Walker?
No, I think that's true. I mean, and it's a very musical and artistic family. I don't know her exact number of siblings, but I know that not only does she have siblings from the relationship between her parents, but she has a lot of half siblings as well.
Yes.
And it seems to hear her tell it in an interview I just re-listened to of her, there's also a lot of dancers in her family, and everybody is doing some sort of creative or performance art. And as one of the younger children in this family, even as exceptionally gifted as she was as a young child, which I know we'll get into, it seems like maybe Fiona Apple was among the last to know how special her talents are because of the pond that she grew up in, so to speak, around a lot of people who are creatively gifted.
Yeah, she does have 6 siblings, so I have that in my notes here. And I mean, anytime you're going to have a family that large and as successful as her family has been, I think to differentiate yourself without disassociating yourself is always going to be a challenge. I can't pretend. I know Brandon is her father. I know her brother. I believe it might be Garrett, is a pretty accomplished actor. And then we just highlighted Maud or Amber. I'm not sure what is her preference, but I believe Maud is kind of the moniker or name that she likes to go under. Yeah, it's just incredible. And I mean, it's really cool to me, not just from the Fiona Apple side, but from the side of her siblings, right? Fiona Apple, I don't know at what point you become a household name or not, right? But she is, I would say, the most widely known within her pool of siblings and so forth. But I just think it's very cool to see that her siblings it might all be under this sort of more theatrical performative banner, but are all, have chosen very different paths, right? I don't know. It's really neat to me. And I mean,
is Maud the sibling who sings on some of her albums? Okay.
Yes.
I know that her sister, particularly on the last two records, Fiona Apple has put out, that her sister sings on some of those songs.
Yes, and Fiona Apple, obviously, there is listeners. I'm gonna kind of let Walker take the helm here. There's obviously a ton to discuss. Those of you that may be diehard Fiona Apple fans that have been waiting for a podcast such as this, please do not labor under the delusion that we have summarized what is a very tumultuous, challenging, nuanced childhood in terms of events, emotional, etc. Again, Walker, I want to let you take over here as far as how much we really want to delve into that. But since this is not a discussion on the album title or its lyrics or anything like that, but just sort of a broad overview, how much did you want to talk about various pinnacle life events leading up to the album title or her signing? Because I do have a lot on that, but I don't know if we want to save that for title or not in terms of even just her discovery as an artist.
I think that we can talk about, I'd like to talk about how she became a musician. And I agree. I think that the origins of her as a signed artist is probably more relevant to the discussion of her first album. But what I think is really, really interesting about Fiona's kind of musical journey is she is a classically trained pianist. She started composing her own pieces at age 8. I actually just on YouTube before we got on was watching some home video footage of her as a little girl playing on like a little toy keyboard. And it's like a very cool, weird little composition that you wouldn't mistake for somebody else's. It sounds like something that somebody made up themselves. And in the video, the person filming it sounds like a man's voice. So probably her dad says, that's Fiona's first composition. She taught herself how to do her own songs by discovering a book of jazz standards that her mom had. I believe in an attic or in storage. And I believe that book was called The Book of Favorites. I might have that wrong, but in any case, it was a book of jazz standards. And she would teach herself these songs from the music written out in this book and then go out and get the records and try to see how close she got. Now, where she's not classically trained is in the vocal department. Fiona Apple has an incredible singing voice, an incredible vocal range. I think that, and I'm going to actually interrupt myself a little bit and say, I feel like I'm going to be making a lot of Radiohead comparisons throughout this season. It's really just because that was the last thing we discussed, so I kind of can't help but notice things that are either similar or different and kind of think of them that way, just as a little bookending of the two seasons. It's more my connection to both the things than that Fiona Apple and Radiohead are intricately connected in any way. But it did make me think of what we love about the dual approach of Tom and Johnny. And that, with Johnny, you have this very, what is the word? What is the word I'm searching for?
Technically proficient.
Thank you. Very technically proficient, very versed in theory. And with Tom, he doesn't read music, et cetera, et cetera. And I feel like he kind of has, Yeah, he's a fucking idiot who sucks, and I feel like, and I feel like you kind of have this same dichotomy presented in one person, in Fiona Apple, where her voice, while she has a very beautiful singing voice, I think that it is unusual in a way that maybe it would be, more standard jazz crooning or something if she had been vocally trained. I guess I don't know. That's a hypothetical, but I think that the kind of mix of approaches of being a classically trained pianist and somebody who is self-taught vocally is part of what makes her music so unique. And one thing I will say about her recordings before she was signed and before she was recording her debut album Tidal, she actually recorded those songs with the intention. She knew she could write songs and she had confidence as a songwriter and composer, but it was with the intention of being able to sell those songs to other artists, which I think is really, really interesting. And it wasn't until those songs made it into the hands of people in the music industry that the feedback was like, you have an amazing voice. Yes. And I don't think it's false modesty based on just like how kind of much of an open book she seems to be in terms of what she'll say about herself and her music and how she feels about those things, that she kind of didn't know that she was a great singer until that happened.
Yeah, so if I could just kind of like streamline a little bit of what you just said, this is taken from the article written by M. Sullivan from iMusic. The publication date was 1996, and it says Fiona Apple's story goes something like this. She'd been living in LA and had just finished working on her demo tape when she decided to fly home to New York for Christmas. Once there, she handed a copy of the tape to a family friend who, it turns out, often babysat for a bigwig music industry executive. The friend gave the tape to the exec, who in turn played it at a party he was throwing. As fate would have it, producer and manager Andrew Slater, he's going to come up a lot, was attending the party, and upon hearing this tape was immediately intrigued. At 18, she's an accomplished vocalist and pianist, and her material suggests a wealth of experience and a wisdom that belies her young age. Many of the tracks on Tidal, so I'm going to cut myself off there, right? Because then we're going into her debut album. But I also wanted to read just a couple other things regarding her influences, which, this was the case with Radiohead as well. The thing that I really, really like about studying such an accomplished musician like a Tom York or a Johnny Greenwood or a Fiona Apple or even a Flea is the push that it'll give you as a listener and as somebody that wants to be able to discuss this with some level of intelligence. Is it pushes me to venture into listening to other music that is often not other great white artists, but are much more diverse than that, right? So I'm going to pull from a Pitchfork retrospective article written by Jen Pelly. The publication date of this was August 13th, 2017. Now, it does talk about Tidal as a retrospective, but Walker, if you'll allow me, it's about 2 paragraphs long.
Yeah.
The internal... Okay, so this is author Jen Pelly right here in the second paragraph. The internal rhymes hang on to one another and lift you up. No surprise, then, that spirals of poetry and jazz formed Fiona. She began on a piano as an 8-year-old in Manhattan, right? Walker just spoke of this, with a collection of standards called The Real Book. Ella Fitzgerald and Billie Holiday were her favorites.
Got it.
Okay. She was sent to psychiatrists, which she resented. Once, staring at an ink blotch, she made out the shape of a beetle and so proclaimed then that she saw John Lennon's face. So probably something like the Rorschach test is what it's talking about. Fiona has referred to Lennon as God and Maya Angelou as her mother. So Maya Angelou being the person that whose name I've heard many, many times come up in conversation, but was not super familiar with her work and still remain not super familiar, I should say as well. But as the podcast goes on, I'm going to familiarize myself more so than where I'm at today. So again, just to back up, Fiona has referred to Lennon as God and Maya Angelou as her mother. She slept with a compilation of Angelou's writing under her pillow. She had brought me through some tough times and shown me a light, Fiona once said of Angelou, who she thanks in the liner notes of Tidal's vinyl reissue for everything you've ever written. In Angelou's memoir, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, which, just to put a button on that, who does that titling kind of remind you of a little bit, right?
Yeah, of course.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful title for a memoir, which was first published in 1969. She describes her experience at 8 years old of being raped in her mother's St. Louis home. After she grows quiet, she is no longer interested in games. When I refused to be the child they knew and accepted me to be, I was called impudent and my mutinous sullenness. Angelou writes, she is sent to Arkansas to live with her grandma, never knowing if her St. Louis family just got fed up with my grim presence. There is nothing more appalling than a constantly morose child. Angelou only warms up to the idea of talking again when a woman tells her that it takes the human voice to infuse words with the shades of deeper meaning. You can see why Fiona, having also been raped outside her home at age 12, retreating inward and taking solace in the act of writing, would find strength in this. Her music, too, is all words, all messages to decode, a potent mix of literary ambition and raw truth. Scaling the depths of her vocal register, she swings and punches and finesses phrases with smoke. I'm so sorry. Now, I realize listeners just hearing somebody read something verbatim can maybe not be the most interesting, but I do want to recommend these retrospectives that are written from Pitchfork and from iMusic. They're really, really beautiful. They're really, really raw, male and female authors. And I think this just goes to a point that I really want to emphasize early on, which is something that I learned in therapy, which is suffering is relative. And can I relate to something that somebody like a Maya Angelou or even a Fiona Apple experienced in terms of assault and what it gave them? No, I cannot. And that's something that I'm actually grateful for. But I think that what authors of both these retrospectives speak to, one being a man, one being a woman, is kind of a reflection upon why, and they're both older than me, right? But why did Title and Win the Pawn, but specifically Title, why did they resonate with me, a young boy, is one of the author's kind of reflection. And then the author, I believe it's in an MTV article. I'm not going to butcher it right now. I'm sorry. It's a Los Angeles Times. Her name is Elisa Gardner. She talks about one of the things she says very early on in her article is what it comes down to, though, is Fiona Apple is just a great songwriter. So I may have been a little bit all over the place there by saying suffering is relative and this and that, but that is really what I want to root my foundation and all of this in, is Fiona Apple is just a great songwriter, right? There's all this trauma. There's all these things that we're going to speak to, but that's what can't be forgotten. And I think that applies to any great artist. But with Fiona Apple, there is a degree of torment that I think is really, really interesting and heartbreaking to kind of learn about. But just for me, just for Zach Glenn, I just wanted to put that out there before really much else is said.
Yeah, I really appreciate everything you just laid out. That's also sounds like a very good article. I'd like to read that if you'll send it to me. I think it's good that you mentioned this sexual assault that's part of her history, because it's certainly not something that I think either of us want to dwell on, but it is a part of Fiona Apple's story that she has talked about. And I think that it will probably be relevant to reference it over the course of discussing her career when she does. Because this is something that she spoke about very publicly when thrust into the limelight as a young woman of 18 years old. And I think a couple things are interesting in terms of how she discusses this event in her life, because she has said that she hasn't written songs about this. Because
I saw that as well.
Yeah, because, when she was public about this event in her life, people found a lot of what they considered to be references to this in her lyrics, myself included. There's a lot of songs that I've heard that I kind of assumed were referencing this.
Particularly on her debut album, just for me personally.
Yeah. I think that what it really sets up as an important, I can't speak to how she may feel about the pivotal nature of a trauma like that in her life. And I also think it's reductive to every time trauma or pain or anger or these things are referenced or themes in her music to take it all back to this event. doesn't seem correct to me. But I think what it sets up about Fiona Apple as a artist and as a public figure is that she spoke very plainly about things that are uncomfortable topics in our culture still, at a time where I feel like, not that we're so great about it now, but where I feel like the media and probably audiences too, just like the public at large, were less gracious about hearing those things said in the words of some. For example, I'm fumbling a little bit because what I'm trying to say is she also would very candidly address being a young woman who is being highly sexualized as a artist, objectification of young women in the media. And I think what this sets up is a very contentious relationship between Fiona Apple and the press and the public that I do think at this point in her career, she has really come out on the other side of as being incredibly
progressive and ahead of the game.
But also I think in terms of how she's perceived too. I think think that culture has caught up a little bit to Fiona Apple, and
I agree.
But we'll get into it more with the albums, but there's a lot of really condescending and really gross things written about her when she's very intelligently speaking to really heavy shit. And I think also that over the course, because as we discuss the course of her albums, I also want to discuss things that are happening in her career and personal life that's also a public life, right? That affect, because this is somebody who, that for a lot of different reasons, there's a long break between albums. There's periods where she stops playing music in public. There's periods where her interviews are really combative. And I think that Fiona Apple, for a good chunk of her career, got kind of slapped with the label of crazy. Very unfairly. But being a complicated person openly was not something that created great treatment of her in the media. And I think that discussing her frank disclosure of the sexual assault that she went through is like a big part of where that kind of open dialogue starts. I actually have a couple quotes that are not about that specifically, but I do think kind of relate to just this overall approach to how she presented herself in public, if you don't mind.
No, please go ahead.
This is a quote that is I wrote it down word for word, but there's some paraphrasing in here. She said, "There's lots of people going through a lot of stuff in this world and not saying anything about it, and getting up when they have the opportunity to actually help people watching them. I'm not going to be that kind of person." And then another quote from that same interview says, "I don't want all of my mistakes edited out of my public package. People shouldn't always have to appear stable and content because people aren't always stable and content. I think every emotion is appropriate when it arises." And by the way, this is quotes from earlier. I don't know the exact age that she was, but a young person of 18 or 19 years old. And I think that I think people reacted pretty inappropriately to somebody saying these kind of things when they wanted to put her in the box of a cute pop star, I think.
Yes. And I was thinking about a lot of what you just said when I was reading some of these retrospectives. It's like, do you get like a Billie Eilish, for instance? And I know Billie Eilish has since maybe not, I don't want to say abandoned, but has maybe since not leaned into the idea of completely desexualizing herself, which good for her, because if that is a choice she wants to make, that's great. But when Billie Eilish burst onto the scene and was wearing the really baggy clothing, and she's obviously a very pretty girl, I really, 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 really liked that. I thought that was so cool. And not because I'm of the mind that, women need to desexualize themselves. I think hopefully for all the right reasons, because she's a phenomenal artist. And to paraphrase what I think to be the messaging she was trying to get across to young girls in particular was examine my talent first. And I feel like a lot of what Fiona Apple spoke to, or when I said, do you get a Billie Eilish? Well, of course you do. I don't mean to chalk up Billie Eilish's profound musical talent to Fiona Apple, but that core kind of secondary image thing that even, when did Billie Eilish start making music? That was 2017 or 18, around then is kind of when I remember hearing about her for the first time.
Sure.
So I just think, that sort of influence is really, really cool to see. Billie Eilish's music to me doesn't sound a ton like Fiona Apple, but sort of that image that she was putting out there that even, in the moment I felt was really, really cool. And, did you have something you want to add on that?
I mean, I think it's a really good point. I don't want to interrupt you. I do want to talk about this before we move on.
Well, just kind of where I would wrap up, like just on this little bit, you were talking about how some of the articles written can be, either kind of dated or disgusting or whatever. I came across a good amount of that. Listeners, I don't know why I'm so insecure about like all the great detail that's coming or something like that, but I really do just feel like where a lot of my research is sort of more densely packed is around the album title, which we aren't talking about today. But from Scene Magazine, I just want to point to a quote specifically where it says, so this would be on the more positive side. It says, leaning more towards lavish cabaret stylings than alternative or pop, a quick glimpse might suggest title is, quote, easy listening. Closer examination, however, reveals a depth, range, and maturity well beyond Apple's 18 years. Vocally, similarities with fellow ingenue Amanda Marshall abound, though it's Apple's disarming openness and sensual air that sets her apart. I'm going to stop there. But then to contrast that, there's a quote from an article written by Chris French of Music Strip where he says, still getting in tune with the theatrics of onstage performance, Fiona is still learning the do's and don'ts of the entertainment business. And I wrote that down, and it was just like the do's and don'ts. What are the do's and don'ts? By sort of pushing around outside of the do's and don'ts, sometimes you create a whole new thing unto your own. And I don't think that Chris French is some misogynist asshole by saying that giving her debut album 3 out of 4 stars. I mean, it's like there's plenty of things that I said that I know aren't rooted in misogyny or all these labels that we casually throw around that sometimes are very much there. But that is a quote where it's just kind of like, dude, you don't know you don't know what you're talking about. The do's and don'ts of the entertainment business. A lot of times the best stuff is built off of sort of working outside of the do's and don'ts. So I don't mean to have strayed us too far away, Walker, but
I don't think you have. I think this is all going to continue to be very relevant to her career. And like I said, I think that like the beauty of her music, the resonance of like the honesty of her lyrics, it's so personal and so specific that it can really, really resonate with the listener on this level that it feels like it's just for you. It's just like any good art. When the person really, really speaks their truth, it can feel like your truth, right? But I think that I don't like that quote that you just read, and I do think that that's some of that.
Sorry.
No, no. I think that is some of that condescension that we're talking about. But I also think that it is raising the true conflict that she found herself kind of embroiled in. This is not a person who was coached to behave how they're supposed to behave now that they're famous and say only things that make us comfortable. And you were talking about kind of paving the way for female artists to, and I think I understood your point here, because it's not, you're not saying that to be taken seriously, you need to be desexualized, but basically to present as how they want to present, right?
Yes.
In whatever that means. I do think that Fiona Apple is a super big part of that. I also think that she's way ahead of the curve on we were talking earlier about how, the last, let's say, decade of kind of media and culture has been very concerned with like, what are we examining and what do we have to say?
Yeah.
Look at these things in the last, like these kind of public reckonings with like Britney Spears, like the Free Britney thing, or like, hey, why did the Super Bowl wardrobe malfunction like kill Janet Jackson's career, but not Justin Timberlake's, or all this shit, right? Where it's like we kind of have to like
reevaluation.
Exactly, of like, hey, we were really gross about X, Y, and Z. I'm not saying that that's all Fiona Apple. A lot of those are the artists themselves, you know, getting their chance to come back and kind of have their word about those things. But she is somebody who was calling out these very kind of things as they were happening to her. And I think that the music press and the press at large and a lot of the public was not comfortable with that or ready for it, and did not, I don't think she was necessarily celebrated at that time for that level of candor. I think it made a lot of people really uncomfortable, and you know, again, and it was easier to slap the label of kind of like unstable, crazy, etc. on this person because there were moments in public where you know, you kind of saw her succumb to the pressures of being this famous and objectified individual.
And especially in contrast to some of her contemporaries. I'm not saying that I do or do not elevate Fiona Apple, you know, above these other artists, but the Sheryl Crows, the Alanis Morissette, Tori Amos, you know, those three artists represent a really wide range of expressiveness about, and I'm not saying that Alanis Morissette and Sheryl Crow have not been an advocate in a tremendous way for feminism and treatment of women and all of those things. They for sure have. But I would just say that Fiona Apple, and I'm spectating on this, maybe slightly less commercial in that regard, especially being a younger person. But I love this dialogue. If I could, though, this is sort of where I wanted to just personally put a pin in sort of various articles I found, and I wanted to quote directly. And listeners, we're not really going to be able to re-edit this, so I would just like to apologize and say I think I misattributed a previous quote to an MTV article I found. I had it in my notes, kind of in a silly order, so I'll reorganize before next episode. But this article from MTV at the time, the writer was Beth Weingartner, and the publication date was November 4th, 1998. And I just have a few lines highlighted that, again, do speak to the debut album title, but I think really, really nicely summarizes what I was trying to say. And Swacker, if I could just read a little bit from that,
please.
So she's, and I think I did quote this directly. She says, "What makes Apple and the songs which appear on her debut album title special is how unique they are. It's not that she's a good songwriter for a teenager. It's that she's just a great songwriter, period." I just love that. Sometimes I love simplicity in my summations. One of the most remarkable things, she goes on to say, one of the most remarkable things about Apple is her intense self-possession. As a lyricist, she focuses on relationships, most of which are in trouble. But she's not weeping about it. In Sleep to Dream, a song that I absolutely love from her debut album. In Sleep to Dream. Oops. In Sleep to Dream, a rhythm-heavy track in which Apple's low, menacing vocal stands alone through the first verse. She sings, "You say you love..." You say love is, I just want to sing it. "You say love is a hell you cannot bear." Just kidding. And I say, "Give me mine back and then go there for all I care. This mind, this body, and this voice cannot be stifled by your deviant ways." I mean, and the reason why she quotes that, listeners, is just to go back a step. She said, as a lyricist, she focuses on relationships, most of which are in trouble, but she's not weeping about it. I love that. It's such a great observation. And then final little part I just want to quote from this article. She says, "Although Apple considers herself a writer first and then a pianist, her piano work is understated throughout title, blended with percussion, vibraphone, guitar, chamberlain, and bass, while her vocals loom above." So this is a little bit more of a teaser for next week, listeners, if you will. And this goes to something Walker said earlier. Though her voice is untrained, there is an unpolished warmth to it. Often it's as if she's speaking melodically as a poet would, especially in places on Soul and Girl and Carry On, though her natural range is at the low end of alto. So there we go. We can add a little bit of technicality to the untrained nature of her voice. So she's at the low end of alto. Apple occasionally trespasses into upper registers with no ill effects. So as much as this first episode is going to be kind of just more big picture, and that was a review written in 1998 on her debut album, I really did just want to harken on it because that article from Beth Weingartner really, 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 really encapsulates a lot of, clumsily or not, what I was trying to get across.
No, I think that's wonderful. I actually do think that if we can shift into the personal a little bit, that quote that you read very nicely highlights kind of some of what Fiona Apple's music means to me. And maybe I'll speak on that for a second and then kick it over to you.
Sure, I'd love that.
I guess just to kind of, all of these things that we're talking about, we're introducing them now because they're just overarching things that I think will relate to her career, both in the music itself and, the highs and lows of the visibility of her career as a famous artist, right? I guess the one last sort of slightly more technical bit of trivia that I would want to just highlight is these things that we're talking about, addressal of trauma in her past, and then kind of this plain spokenness about uncomfortable topics and issues, personal and political in the press. Fiona Apple is very public about the fact that she has struggled with obsessive compulsive disorder and depression and anxiety and post-traumatic stress throughout her life. And those are things that I think really, really strongly inform the music. But kind of zooming out from that and saying a little more what it kind of means to me, Zach.
Or pulling out, as they would say in the film industry.
Oh, thank you. Wow. And then soon we'll push back in.
There you go. Nice job.
But I've been thinking as we kind of have been getting ready to do the Fiona Apple season. I don't know if you know this, but for many years, if people and now I'm saying this as if I think that we love to pose questions to ourselves where I'm like, has anybody ever asked me this? But if you asked me, I would probably tell you that my favorite songwriters was kind of a tie between Elliott Smith and Fiona Apple.
No kidding.
And by that, and by that, I don't think that I could say that I concretely have one favorite band or artist necessarily, but just in terms of that these songs feel like they're, written for me, right?
Sure.
Those have always just been the two people whose voices and kind of point of view presented in their music resonates with me the strongest.
Love it.
Now, obviously, I think that both Fiona Apple and Elliott Smith, if people were to kind of say one thing about their music, they would say it's sad.
Awesome. Oh, sad, sure.
And I think that we talked a lot, too, about this being something that is said about Radiohead a lot.
Yes.
And so. I think things getting slapped with the label of sad, it is true that I think I tend to gravitate towards more melancholy or sad music. But as discussed a ton in the Radiohead season, I also kind of bristle at what I find to be a little bit of a reductive summation.
Yeah, music to slit your wrist to.
Exactly. But I was thinking about what is it about this quote unquote sad music that I like so much? And I suppose it just feels a little more truthful to me than things being overly shiny and poppy. But I also was thinking a lot about Elliott Smith and Fiona Apple and how you could definitely say both of them are singer-songwriters who work in a very kind of sad key. But I feel like they're talking about very different things.
Sure.
And so this is all a long ramp up to highlight what I love so much about Fiona Apple's music in particular. There's a quote from Elliott Smith that I recall reading that I thought was a very sad and beautiful, very Elliott Smithy quote where he described his music as that he writes songs about how difficult it is to be a person.
Sure.
And I feel like Fiona Apple writes songs about how colorful it is to be a person. And
is this a Walker Glenn quote? That right there?
Yes, because I was just thinking about that quote.
I love that, Walker.
I don't think Fiona Apple songs, I do think a lot of her songs address the difficulties of all the specific things we just laid out, but also love and heartbreak is a major theme in a lot of music,
yes,
but I would say
definitely.
even more predominantly in Fiona Apple's than is typical necessarily. Like she writes about love and love lost, for my money, better than just about anybody else does.
Oh, yeah.
But I feel like there is a real joy to her music that there isn't to other sad music that I gravitate towards. There's something about the way she will write a song that is sad or angry or about anxiety or about that, that sounds like it's about a breakup or is a pointed kind of call out to somebody that has a real, just liveliness to it that I don't think I get from a lot of other artists. There's something very specific to her music where all of these things sound kind of equally reveled in. And there's something of a joy to even her kind of most downer sounding stuff that I find very, very unique to her music. I'm going to quote her again and then kick it over to you. But I just thought this quote kind of underlined that a little bit, where she says, "I'm such an incredibly stupidly sensitive person that everything that happens to me, I experience it really intensely. I feel everything very deeply. And when you feel things deeply and you think about things a lot and you think about how you feel, you learn a lot about yourself. And when you know yourself, you know life." And that was her just like in an interview, like kind of, it's seemingly off the dome, extemporaneously talking about how much emotion there is in her music. But I don't know. To me, it's like kind of like if Elliott Smith's music is a rainy day, kind of all the weather patterns are contained in Fiona Apple's music. And that's not putting down any of these other things I love. It's just something I find very unique about hers. There's a real vibrancy to all of the things that are being expressed, including the difficult things. And that's, I think, why her music has resonated with me so heavily kind of through all stages of my life since I discovered it, but why it, I think, imprinted on me so strongly at the age it did in my early 20s, when I think you are feeling things particularly intensely at that time in your life. And so with that, I want to kind of kick it over to you about like why you feel like her music matters to you and why you would want to talk about it for a season.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I really want to put a button on what you just said about the age in which she became sort of a prominent figure in your musical Mount Rushmore of 47 people, as we've talked about in a Radiohead season. Our Mount Rushmores are not of 4 dudes. It's of, I landed on the number 47, a pretty traditional classic kind of number. Hey, 47, of course, it makes perfect sense, nice and even. But I want to get back to that for myself. I do just want to just add on another point, because I want to kind of stick with some of the articles that we've mentioned this. I just want to say again, from Beth Weingartner's 1998 article, First Taste of Fiona Apple is Sweet from MTV. And I read this quote just a moment ago, but it speaks to what I think the things Walker was saying. She says, one of the most remarkable things about Apple is her intense self-possession. As a lyricist, she focuses on relationships, most of which are in trouble, but she's not weeping about it. And I'll stop there. I think it is really, really unique. And this is outside of the realm of like female artists or whatever, where I would say that's a little bit of a differentiator between, say, her and somebody like Elliott, who, by the way, is also one of my I would put in my top 3 easily as a guitar player and as a songwriter. It's so funny, Walker. I've been on a big Elliott Smith kick. It's just interesting what listening to somebody can like lead you. So I've been listening to a ton of Fiona Apple, the most. in preparing for this season, naturally, you know, little peek behind the curtain, listeners. But I've also been
we listen to the music we discuss.
Yeah, right. I've also been really enjoying an album that for me is not my favorite, but is in my top 3 of Elliott Smith's, called From a Basement on the Hill. I see I got Radiohead in my mind. I'm like, is it From a Basement or From the Basement? From a Basement on the Hill, his swan song, his most you could make an argument for any of them being his most adventurous, but there's a line in the closing track of that album which I do think has a Fiona Apple-ish feel to it, called "A Distorted Reality Is Now a Necessity to Be Free." And it's sort of into the outro coda, key change, what have you, where he says, "God knows why my country don't give a fuck." And it's not a particularly Elliott Smith type lyric for me to commentate on such a broad thing of the forgotten, right? And obviously Elliott Smith, and not obviously, I should say Elliott Smith and Fiona Apple, you could make a case for them being the forgotten, or you could make the opposite argument. Hey, cool to you that they're, you know, commentating on these things. These are both white people. In the case of Fiona Apple, coming from a certain echelon of wealth, it is also very in vogue to point out right now that where people come from, you know, are the voices that are heard the most. I get all that, right? I get it. But that's not really what we're talking about. So I do just want to say that, like, while I am aware that this is sort of relative, I think what Fiona Apple and Elliott Smith have in common is, at least in that one line of dialogue, is sometimes the forgotten. Because Fiona Apple and people that suffer from depression or trauma or can't seem to sort of make it over the hump often are sort of the forgotten, right? And I just love that line so much. God knows why my country don't give a fuck, right? It's like the Vietnam War veteran, the Van Goghs or whatever, you know, people that are not celebrated at the time. And I do love the comparison you made that Fiona Apple, I can't nail it precisely, but like commentates maybe more on the color of life rather than on just like the black and white morose nature, which is not at all to distill Elliott down just to that. But I don't know if that was a necessary or not addition, but I would love to kind of get into the when and why I found her after so much of what you said sparked so many thoughts in my mind. So I just wanted to add that on. But did you have anything else you wanted to say?
No, I mean, you get it. And I want to be really clear, even though he's not the artist we're talking about. It's not drawing this distinction is not saying that I think one is better than the other. I just think something that is so, you get so much of, well, as much as you can without knowing somebody personally. I feel like you really get unfiltered her through her music. And when I watch her like perform or listen to her in conversation with somebody, watch an interview, she's just like so energetic and engaging and, you know, kind of like wonderfully all over the place. And that is what I get from this music is it feels like there are some people who, even if they really struggle in life emotionally, mentally, or more like circumstantially, because like you're saying, it's all relative, right?
Yeah,
like
sure.
Some people have like all the advantages on paper, but like are still feel really fucked up all the time. A lot of people, I think, feel that way.
Yeah.
But there are certain people who I do not count myself among them, but I've known a few people, and it's a very rare quality. There are people who are able to really, really appreciate all of those, appreciate grief as much as they appreciate the beginning of something, you know, who see as much beauty in the end of a relationship as they do in a relationship blossoming, as in death as they do in birth, you know? Yeah. I don't know if that's how she feels, but that's how her music makes me feel.
God damn.
And that's something that I really, really love.
Oh, I loved that. Well, I mean, gosh, just in the interest of time, I think you said back a couple minutes ago, though, like that when her music really imprinted upon you was in your early 20s. You know, I had a very similar experience. You know, I think I mentioned it in our closing out of the Radiohead season, that our mother had the album Tidal on compact disc, which is something I want to dig into a little bit deeper when we discuss that album, rather. Just sort of the cool nature of that, and not really something that I see fitting in, given a lot of the other kind of music. But we'll talk about that later. But I started listening to Fiona Apple as a staple of my musical catalog in the year of 2012. So what was going on in that year? So I would have been turning 23. I was 22. I was going to the California State University, Chico, and I was working for Domino's Pizza as a pizza delivery driver. And this is an interesting detail because, Spotify was definitely something that I could afford and later subscribe to. But Pandora was what I was rocking in the car, along with podcasts. But this was sort of the last gasp of musical variety, whether I wanted it or not. And I got really, really, really into Pandora would, sort of start to tailor your stations based on what you liked or, whatever. It's still an app that was very much driven on interaction with it to make sure that it was giving you the correct choices. But I started listening to a lot of 07, a lot of Air, a lot of The Bird and the Bee, a lot of Regina Spektor, and a lot of Fiona Apple, right? Because and it's really, really cool to think about, right? That my musical tastes were never bifurcated such that I like male-driven rock star music. I will very, very humbly say that is something that I'm really grateful that I don't think my taste has ever been that segmented, and I would like to chalk that up to a lot of great influence and stuff. But I do think that our mom specifically exposed us to a lot of great female-driven rock and roll, we'll just say, for lack of a better term. Mm-hmm. But as a dude who Radiohead was his favorite band at that point, right? Even still, this was a really, 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 really cool chapter in my musical listening. And the individual who is now my wife, Kailani Glenn, I think was a direct influence over that too, of somebody that maybe had a more open-minded sort of sense of self. I can't chalk it all up to like these, 1 to 2 little things, but driving in my car till 3-4 in the morning, delivering pizzas, listening to music on Pandora, where I did not get to choose the selection that was upcoming besides thumbs upping it, really, 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 really opened up my world, I would say musically. And I would say this was one of the last times that this happened in my life. Now, as I've spoken about, when we've gone through these artists, Maya Angelou, Fela Kuti, with Atoms for Peace, yes, I do feel more musically, not educated, but more musically well-rounded as an individual than I ever have in my life. But it's like with anything, right? When your mind is a little bit more virginal and young, and you can think back and go, hopefully, we look back and we say, oh, I cringe all the time. This is a period where I look back and I am delighted and I have a sense of joy, and things are never going to be perfect. I'm sure we're going to say, I speak for myself. I'm sure I'll say things throughout this season that if I am to listen back to it 5 years from now, I might go, oh man, I might word that a little bit differently now or whatever. But I think what this is rooted in is a lot of good intention and a lot of joy, though, for me, just to think back on like, man, it's so cool that like, not to please anybody, certainly not to plan for this podcast. That was a period in which a lot of things opened up that were female driven sort of solo artists or acts. But I would like to let you, please expound upon that if you have any thoughts, directly related or not.
Yeah. Well, I'll just I do, because this is kind of a question that you've posed off pod, and in this case, it was such a good question that I did not tap the sign that all conversation is content. But don't make me tap the sign, kid. But I feel like you had kind of brought that to the table as a point of discussion of like, hey, is Fiona Apple a little bit of the fork in the road where your musical taste expanded to including more female artists? Yeah. And I think similarly to you, I don't know if I can. Well, actually, I guess you are kind of tying it to a specific point where your music taste really changed. Mine is kind of a qualified yes also, because I know that since the time Fiona Apple came fully on my radar as something that was a part of my adult musical taste, I can't really think of who were my really important female fronted or female solo musicians up till that point. And it's a huge part. It's a huge part of what I listen to now. That isn't something that I do consciously, but I do think that probably her music speaking to me as much as it did must have something to do with that. Because what I told you when we were talking about this, when you kind of posed that question, is I don't remember there being a point where that was consciously an impediment to me getting into somebody, but it seems pretty undeniable that it had to have been a bias.
Sure.
Unconsciously or not, because there is a lot of great music out there and a lot of it is made by women, and for my taste to not reflect that at all up to a certain point, being as big of a music fan as I have been through my entire life, you know, that means that bias was there. And I wonder what that was. And I think that there was probably a point where I might have had the idea that if I'm going to listen to such direct and emotional songwriting that is coming from a female artist, that it's not going to give me something that I don't want, but it's going to give me something different.
Yes.
And the way I feel about that now is not that there isn't something specific about the music of Fiona Apple, or more broadly about the songwriting from a female artist in general. It's not that like the perspective isn't informed by those things, right? But it is that thing of just like, oh, I relate to this music because it's personal and specific and emotionally honest. And that is what I actually look for in music. And if you, and by you, I mean like speaking to this hypothetical version of my younger self that I'm speculating may have been less open to this, just based on what my music taste looked like. You know, you're kind of, if you think that you can't get that from somebody who doesn't look like you, then you're only clowning yourself, because you're just missing out on a bunch of stuff that will absolutely speak to you, because the more kind of information you can get about the human experience at large, that's, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like that's all,
yes.
That's all there for it. It's all for everyone, I think.
Absolutely. I love that. One thing, this is sort of the median position potentially on what you're saying, if I'm understanding you correctly, somebody whose breadth of work and catalog that I really feel like, while being completely different and actually in a different music or a different artistic delivery system that reminds me of Fiona Apple and my experience with their body of work, is Sofia Coppola. So I have seen all of Sofia Coppola's films. Some of them I am ecstatic about how much I love them, and some of them maybe not as much. Something that reminds me a little bit of watching her films, particularly her earlier films, and listening to Fiona Apple, is they're just great films, or they're just great albums, right? We've established that. Okay, we've nailed that point. However, I think in films like The Virgin Suicides, or even more recently, The Beguiled, there's something that is so unique about the feelings they give me, in that it's particular. And now I'm talking about Sofia Coppola, but in something like The Virgin Suicides, the exploration of sort of the sacredness of female virginity and how difficult it is to, and this is just a read on the film. I don't know that this is what the film is about, but just sort of the fragile nature of being a beautiful young woman in a family with very strict rules, and in a society that is so contradictory with what we're impressing upon women to be, whether it's sexualized or desexualized or this or that. It's a very specific type of melancholy, which is not the only feeling I get from her movies, that I just can't get elsewhere. And so I do think there is something to positive segmentation or identifying those feelings that are very, very unique that the artist is giving you, then also sort of getting rid of that. So it's a very interesting dichotomy, right? Like the amount of female directors that I like will often, when I like, listeners have noticed, it's not hard for me to reference Kubrick, Spielberg, Scorsese, whomever, right? But Sofia Coppola is not somebody that I don't even have any notes on that for this, right? So that does not matter. But I'm just trying to say that, like, I think it's important to put things on an even plane, but then also not totally forget the uniqueness of that delivery system of a female perspective. And I think, at least as a man, I think that's really, really important. And I love that comparison that I just made, because it's like, at the end of the day, they're just great movies. And in her case too, Sofia Coppola, that's a hell of a name to live up to, of her father, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think she's absolutely done that and separated herself as unique. But that and I get it with certain painters. I'm not talking about like Georgia O'Keeffe. That's obviously very feminine, like a lot of feminine anatomy, like laden, but like just pick a Renaissance painter that was a female. Like, you just get a different type sometimes of tone. And I really think you get that with Sofia Coppola. I really think you get it with Fiona Apple. That's not a comparison that I want to draw upon constantly throughout, but it's just something that occurred to me. And I also, in the spirit of this discussion, I mentioned Billie Eilish earlier. I'm also a huge fan of Sia. I don't know if you're a fan of Sia at all, but I love Sia. And I
don't really.
I'm not sure.
I don't know any songs other than Chandelier, I don't think.
Oh man! Well, she did a solo album. She did an album, her 2009 album, with the guitar player of The Stroke, Nick Valencia, called "We Are Born," that I would love to recommend to you. That I think has a lot of Fiona Apple influence in sort of her vocal rhythm. And then just to go back a few steps, some of the other solo artists that I love that I would say come way before this sort of Pandora era, that have always been staples in my catalog, would be Bonnie Raitt, Linda Ronstadt, Sarah McLachlan, and then I wrote as a joke Jamie Lee Curtis, because I just fucking love Jamie Lee Curtis so much. She's not a rock and roll musician, but that was a little bit. I have way more on that we might get into in a future episode. That was a little bit of a ham-fisted addition there. We can cut that, Walker, if you like, but that concludes sort of all the things that I wanted to get out up front on this opening episode for me personally.
Yeah, that's great. I think we can wrap it up. I feel like just so it doesn't drive anyone crazy, we were both supposed to say when we kind of first got into Fiona Apple, and I've referenced it obliquely, but I will just say, like Zach, this is somebody whose career I have been aware of since she came on the scene. Zach and I are the perfect age to have been around for Fiona Apple's debut. Now, the way it actually went for me is Criminal and Shadowboxer were big hits from the album that we're going to discuss next episode. I loved both those songs. I did not remember that our mother owned the CD, but my memory of them is them constantly playing on the Sacramento alternative radio station 100.5 The Zone, which would play a lot of kind of, I guess, what we would call like alternative rock, but with a focus on the more kind of contemporary, softer side of that, right?
Yeah.
So, you are getting your like Matchbox 20s and things like that, but you're also getting a lot of Sarah McLachlan, Tracy Chapman, Fiona Apple, Natalie Imbruglia. I'm only listing female artists, not really on purpose. I'm just trying to think of what,
Dave Matthews Band.
Dave Matthews Band.
On me, home came but a little bit stronger.
Through the window and I stare as you wear nothing but you wear it so well. Tied up and twisted. I wish he would write.
Come on, grind into my dick.
I wish he wouldn't. Gross. I wish he would not like freestyle like that. It's just like it's okay to rhyme, buddy. In any case, yeah, that kind of radio station. Like if you grew up in the '90s, you're familiar with like kind of the palette of like soft alternative radio rock that was available. And I remember loving those songs. I remember being real happy whenever they came on. Kind of lost track of her. I know all her albums very well. I'm happy to say there are none that I'll be kind of discovering for the first time as we listen to this. But it wasn't until 2005 that Extraordinary Machine, her third album, came out. Quite a lengthy gap between her second and third. The second one is Win the Pawn. Very excited to get into that one. But
right?
Yes, was not aware of that one until later. But and that is when she really impacted me as like a songwriter whose work was very important to me, and I followed her career ever since. My memories to that one are 2005. Had just moved to the Bay Area with my girlfriend at the time, and she had Extraordinary Machine on CD, and so I just remember it getting played a lot in the car, singing along to all those songs, really, really loving it. It really connecting with me on an emotional level. And then since then, it's just been a matter of following the albums as they came out. It's only been the Idler Wheel and the much more recent Fetch the Bolt Cutters, but those have been anticipated ahead of their release by me and enjoyed immediately upon their release. When the Pawn was one that I went back to and discovered probably around when the Idler Wheel came out. And now I'm all of them are in some kind of rotation for me. I have all of them on vinyl except for Extraordinary Machine. It was when I last checked was out of print, and so it has become very expensive to get on vinyl, and I do not own that one. But that's my trajectory with terms of my actual discovery of her as an artist, and I'm really excited to dig into each one of these individually and kind of see how they resonate now, what they mean to me now, what's aged amazingly about them, what maybe hasn't. It's going to be a really fun process of discovery. Even though I've listened to these albums a lot over the years, I'm absolutely positive there's going to be a lot new to discover here.
Oh man, I couldn't have said that any better. I did just want to, and I had this written down. I can't believe I forgot to say it, but I'm sure that I said something previously worth cutting in favor of this. So like I said before, my journey of rediscovery culminated in 2012 when I went, oh my God, I know this name. I know this artist, but, really, really, really got into her discography, which coincided directly with, I think the truncated version of the 2012 album is the Idler Wheel. I don't know the full name. Okay, yes. So that makes sense, right? As to maybe why she was coming up on Pandora more frequently. I love that, right? I was the beneficiary of that. So Fiona Apple became somebody that I love from 2012 up through now. But Fetch the Bolt Cutters, I want to say it was a February or March release of 2020, and I know it was a very lauded and revered album. I listened to that album similarly to Radiohead, where it's like I couldn't have become more of a Radiohead fan in my mind at that point. But in 2020, Fetch the Bolt Cutters was the album I listened to the most that year. So as much as I was a huge fan of hers, and that's, many, many episodes away. But yeah, my kind of journey was like this artist. I was not a huge fan when the Pawn came out. I was too young and my musical awareness was quite limited. So to sort of have her reawaken in 2012, become a staple, become familiar with her albums, very familiar, I would say. And then in 2020 to have my number one album of that year be Fetch the Bolt Cutters was a really, really, really cool experience. But yeah, that's all I wanted to add as far as my sort of timeline.
Totally. And I mean, I think it's not surprising that as somebody who was aware of her, because her debut as a artist was very high profile, just the fact that these were songs that got heavy radio play. Oh yeah. But I think that I will say that I think her second album is quite a pivot away from everything that is commercial about her first album. And
get to see the whole face, not just the eyes.
Yes, and you get to see a lot more of the whole person, kind of warts and all on that one. Touché. So I think the fact that it came out in 1999 and Zach and I were, young boys and not hipster deep cut music enthusiasts, it's not surprising we missed that. For me, I think that Extraordinary Machine, I was at the perfect age, and Fiona Apple's kind of what was maybe derided about her at the time of that second album was kind of cemented into what was cool about her at the time of her third album. It made perfect sense for me to get into it, especially through my girlfriend who had cooler music taste than me and exposed me to a lot of cool stuff at that time. And I'd say you being a few years younger than me, it makes sense that 2012 for that to be kind of the same track for you to get into it. I think that we're obviously starting to get into talk about the music specifically, which means we need to put a pin in this and come back to you all next week to talk about the album itself. I'm so excited to do this. Anything else you want to say about this season, Zach, before we
No, I
could
feel I could feel the juices flowing. Like, I mean, I think I had such a great time coming back together. But yeah, I'm just getting excited, just saying the album names and stuff like that, and thinking about. So I think this is a great place to stop.
It's going to be so fun to talk about the actual music. I can't wait to listen to this stuff and talk about it. It's going to be great.
It is. Listeners, those of you that are new or just joining us, welcome. All are welcome to this podcast. I know that may sound a little silly, a little trite, but it's true. Anyone who wants to listen is welcome. And we're just so happy to have you. Those of you that are returning from our Radiohead season, welcome. And if Fiona, I have been very surprised, anecdotally speaking, at the Venn diagram of Radiohead to Fiona Apple fans. It's a very, very small, very, very limited survey, but I thought there might be more overlap. So those of you that have stuck with us and are here and are maybe exploring our catalog, welcome as well. We're so delighted that you're back. I know Walker kind of kicked us off that way. That is all I had to say, because I just am so excited to talk about the music and talk about things at a little bit more of a technical, detailed level. But I love that we kind of were just raw and open on this episode. And I'm really, really excited. That's it for me, though.
And dialogue with us, listeners. Let us know, if there is a specific aspect to Fiona Apple's music or something that she's recorded that is more obscure that you think we might have missed, or, just something about her career that you'd like. I think that, there's, when you're doing a podcast, what I found out, when you talk about something that is really meaningful to a lot of people, there's no way to cover every single aspect that's important to every single fan. But I would be very interested in hearing from listeners on this artist, just about, kind of what it means to you. And if we can fold that into our discussion, we will definitely do our best. We're really doing our darndest to research the heck out of this and to come to it with some knowledge. But, I'd still be curious about what you think we might be missing or what it's meant to you. Zach, this was a great discussion. I'm so happy to be back in the saddle with you. And signing out, I've been Walker Glenn.
I'm Zach Glenn.
And we'll see you next week, listeners. Bye. Idiotalk is a Glenn Brothers production. Get in touch with us at idiotalk.podcast@gmail.com or follow us on Instagram at idiotalk.podcast. And thanks for listening to